Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mayor Brown's second in our series of antitrust programs on navigating global competition law challenges in turbulent geopolitical times. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. Today, our topic is unexpected problems that companies inadvertently create during merger review. Our speakers today will tell you the important steps that you should take even before you sign an M&A agreement in order to avoid these problems. Before we start, let me talk about questions. We hope you will ask questions or make comments. Please send questions on the Q&A tab at any time, in English or in Japanese. We will hold questions until the end, and the speakers will reserve time to answer questions. If you do submit a question, we may ask you to unmute your microphone to ask your question directly to the speakers. And if you are able to turn on your camera at any time during the presentation, we'd really appreciate it. Next slide, please. So today our speakers are Bill Stallings from the US, Jean-Maxime Blutel from our Paris office, and Isabel Georgi from our Brazil office. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them. So first of all, the principles we're talking about today, they occur in mergers all over the world. So we think it is useful to have antitrust competition practitioners from different regions of the world. And they will be showing you examples from the EU and Latin America, together with Bill, who will be discussing the US. So Bill Stallings previously spent 17 years at the US DOJ's antitrust division. He held several key roles there, including chief of the transportation, energy, and agriculture sections. Bill has responsibility for merger reviews, civil conduct investigations, and litigating cases. He works in industries such as airlines, oil field chemicals and services, meat packing, shipping, agricultural products, energy generation, and financial services. Jean-Maxime assists companies in early assessments of their M&A projects under EU law and globally. And in particular, Jean-Maxime is known for advising companies in regulated industries, such as telecommunications, transportation, construction, infrastructure, energy, and utilities. Maxime advises on merger control, foreign direct investment, and on the EU foreign subsidies regulation. Isabella has extensive experience in antitrust matters and advises clients from various industries in merger control matters, including complex merger control filings and negotiation of antitrust remedies before the Brazilian antitrust authorities. Isabella also worked in our Washington, D.C. office and is currently based in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And Bill, let me turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Marcia, and thank all of you for joining us today. Over the past few years, the antitrust agencies worldwide have been incredibly aggressive in challenging mergers on competition grounds. I think we see that in all jurisdictions. And indeed, that was the subject of our first webinar in this series that we had last month. Today, though, we want to talk about a different trend that's occurring that relates to mergers. This is not agencies challenging deals because they raise competition concerns, but instead investigating the actions of the merging parties. We call these side investigations. And what are these side investigations? You can think about it today in four different categories that we're going to talk about. First is when parties to a deal just start collaborating too early, commonly referred to as gun jumping. Second, when parties to the deal improperly share competitively sensitive information. Third, parties when approaching the agencies to undertake the competition review provide incomplete or misleading submissions. And then finally, fourth, parties submitting evidence during the merger review that actually shows other antitrust violations that the government then investigates. And that is definitely a worst case scenario. No one wants to be in these situations, but we see them occurring more and more frequently. As Marcia said, I practice in the US, John Maxime in the EU, and Isabella in Brazil. And in all of us have seen these investigations occur with more frequency. We'll talk about why that's happening. But one thing we want to stress is that the risks are clear. These side investigations carry the potential for significant exposure. The agencies usually get monetary fines, there are penalties, reputational damage to both companies and to individual executives, and they could also result in a delay of the merger closing itself. So throughout this webinar today, what we'll do is discuss the risks. We'll go through each of these four categories, provide a brief overview of what the relevant principles are. And I think very interestingly, these principles are the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We'll then for each one provide an example just so you can understand how these situations arise. And then importantly, in the end, we'll offer some practical solutions that hopefully will help you minimize the risks of these distracting side investigations from occurring. So with that, let me turn it over to John Maxime to talk about gun jumping. If we could have the next slide, please. And the next one.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon to everyone. Early collaboration is clearly the main source of gun jumping cases around the world. And the risk, it exists throughout the whole transactional process when conducting due diligence, of course, when drafting and negotiating the agreements, after signing, when the purchaser can be asked to approve certain actions of the target, when preparing for future integration, in pre-closing meetings, when interacting with customers, suppliers, partners. As Bill said, the principles are generally the same across all jurisdictions, and in substance, it is legitimate for the parties to discuss and enter into a transaction, but at the same time, they must continue to behave independently until the transaction is closed. After signing, it is legitimate for the purchaser to make sure that the target does not take any action that could adversely affect the target's value before closing, but at the same time, the purchaser should not interfere in the conduct of the target's ordinary business. Before closing, it is legitimate again for the parties to plan for future integration so that everything is ready on day one, but they cannot start to implement the transaction already. They can plan for the future, but they cannot already build the future. So in practice, it's always a question of finding the right balance between what is necessary and proportionate for a purpose, which is perfectly legitimate, and what is not justified, what could wait or be done differently. And this is where most practical challenges arise when it comes to ensuring compliance with competition law. And in the end, it is really a matter of case-by-case assessment. And there is, unfortunately, very little guidance from the authorities on this. This is because they would not want such guidance to be opposed to them in another context, for instance. And also because actually there are no clear red lines that could apply equally to any and all situation. So in most cases, it will be a matter of judgment, of self-assessment, of risk assessment. But what the objective is legitimate, the answer will almost certainly be yes, this can be done, but only to that extent, only with these persons, only subject to those protection measures. And in tricky cases, these These decisions can get quite uncomfortable as a in-house lawyer, as a project manager, because these questions rely on self-assessment. They should be taken only after discussing internally and with the other party to understand why this is needed, why we cannot do with less, why we cannot do this differently or later, and also to discuss all possible practical implications, all possible uses from a business perspective. But these are the main questions that will inform on whether there is a risk and how it can be effectively addressed. We'll discuss other recommendations and solutions in more detail shortly, but early collaboration is clearly the most common pitfall, and it is under close scrutiny from competition authorities. Next slide, please. So a famous example of this is the European Commission's decision in the Altis case. So Altis is a French-based company active in the telecommunications sector. It's mostly active in Europe, also in the US. In 2015, it acquired PT Portugal, which was the main telecommunication operator in Portugal. So the merger was cleared by the European Commission, but 3 years later, Altis was fined 125 million euros for gun jumping. So there are, of course, other important gun jumping cases, but this one is interesting because the decision describes a wide range of practices. There are 3 broad categories of practices. The first one, the Commission considered that the veto rights that were provided for in the transaction agreements were going beyond what was necessary for the purpose of preserving the value of PT Portugal. But Altis had two broad veto powers in those agreements. Second category of practices, the Commission considered that there had been a number of instances where Altis consent was sought by PT Portugal even outside the scope of the transaction agreement. For instance, the Commission found that Altis approved the main features of a marketing campaign, interfere in the negotiation of major commercial agreements, in a supplier selection process. And the third category of practices in this decision is the Commission found that the parties had exchanged a lot of commercially sensitive information on PT Portugal's commercial strategy, on its pricing, key agreements, costs, etc. And what struck the Commission is that these exchanges took place without any non-disclosure or clean team agreement being put in place. So in the end, Altis was fined 125 million euros. And what is also worth noting is that in this fine, it is actually made of 2 types of gun jumping violations. One violation for starting to collaborate before notifying the transaction to the Commission. In other words, this is a violation of the obligation to notify prior to closing. And another violation for not waiting for the Commission's approval to implement the transaction. In other words, this is a violation of the obligation to suspend completion before the Commission's clearance. So the Commission clearly wanted here to make a deterrent example. And it is true that there is quite a lot of food for thoughts in this decision. But Isabella will now talk about another type of potential gun jumping violation, which is the improper exchange of sensitive information. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jean-Maxime, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's, of course, known that it is required to share information during due diligence and also integration planning phases. However, whenever the information exchange is a competitively sensitive information, this exchange can raise competition concerns. So there are 3 principles that should guide this exchange in order to mitigate the risk. These principles are largely accepted and acknowledged by the agencies. So we first should make sure that this information is limited to what is objectively necessary, this being reaching an agreement or planning for day one after the closing of the deal. So in this context, you should have a legitimate purpose to share this information that it's competitively sensitive. Also, to ensure that the whole process is done correctly, we should put into place clean teams and ring fencing measures. So all the influx of information is carefully controlled. In most countries, we would have two kinds of violation that could be prompted by sharing this kind of information. We have first, a violation of merger control rules. As Jean-Maxime said, we would have a gun jumping violation. Also, we could have like substantive antitrust rules violation that goes beyond just the gun jumping and the merger review that Bill mentioned in the beginning. So we would be going beyond just the merger review process and having other kinds of implications. Next slide, please. As Jean-Maxime also commented, most of the agencies prefer to discuss information sharing and the risks involved on a case by case. So they do not have guidelines in this respect. However, the Brazilian authority prepared guidelines that are largely based on best practice accepted across jurisdictions, right? So these guidelines offer first a definition of what is competitively sensitive information. So the information has to be specific and directly related to the performance of the company's business. Of course, it involves information like production, process, output, prices, but also involves information that refers to HR. So we are talking about personnel, salaries, and benefits. The guidelines also provide examples of contractual clauses that would be acceptable and would not amount to an early integration, as Jean-Maxime was discussing previously. We also have examples of activities that should be avoided because they would also lead to an early integration and therefore a gun jumping violation. Finally, the guidelines are very useful in offering some suggestions, procedures that could reduce the risk. So we are talking about antitrust protocols that will provide these definitions of what is competitively sensitive information, how to treat and exchange these informations, and general guidance on how clean teams should be assembled and what are the processes that they should put into place to ensure that we do not have another pitfall here in terms of exchanging information since the due diligence until the closing of the transaction. So we now turn to Bill to discuss misleading information and misleading statements and documents. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Isabella. So up till now, in terms of gun jumping and information sharing, we've been talking about how the parties interact with one another during consideration of a deal. What we want to talk about in this section is how parties interact with the competition agencies once it comes time to have the deal reviewed. And we titled this section "Incomplete and Misleading Statements and Documents." What I want to stress here is that we're not talking about companies purposely trying to mislead the agencies. I've never met a client who wanted to purposely mislead the agencies. But what we do see is that these issues arise through inadvertence. And let me kind of explain how that can happen. First off, as I think all of you know that have been involved in any type of merger review, the merger review process itself is incredibly complex and burdensome. It doesn't matter which country you're in front of, whether it's HSR in the US, EU, CADE, the process that parties have to go through to engage with the agencies involves many types of submissions, in terms of drafting documents to explain to the agency what the deal is about, what the marketplace is, what market shares are, any type of competitive effects. It could also involve production of significant number of documents. I think in the US, we're probably the worst one in this regard in terms of the second request production that requires basically millions and millions of pages of documents to be produced. So here's where these issues arise, is that let's talk first about the written submissions to the agency. So these are the types of documents where you are trying to describe the deal and describe the marketplace to the agency. You want obviously to write the deal in these submissions in a thoughtful way. And we're definitely entitled to write them in a way that is objectively true and provides the deal rationale, the objectives, the synergies, in other words, to make the case for the transaction. What you have to be careful though, is to make sure that all the relevant facts are coming out. And what we see is that, look, the business team is very busy. They've just spent probably many months negotiating an incredibly complex deal. Do they really want to sit down with the lawyers at that point to write basically a statement about what the marketplace is? It might be hard to get the business people's attention. That may be the case, but it's incredibly important that you do so, because I think what we see now is that the agencies, if you put facts in a document to the agency and the agency later realizes that those facts might not be right, not that they are, wrong, or you're trying intentionally to mislead them, but somehow you just missed some nuance. You missed a certain key element. The agency can take that as a type of misleading violation. And these types of, then you have an investigation about that, which obviously distracts from the merger review itself and calls into question, what the attorneys that were doing to make the submission, who they talked to, who they relied on. It becomes just a morass in terms of dealing with the agency to resolve the issue. Same type of thing can happen on document productions. Here, most agencies require document preservation, and so you have to be careful within your company to make sure that those right preservation orders have been implemented. They require a thorough search. Now, we all know to produce emails, that's relatively easy. Even producing documents from hard drives from laptops in this day and age is relatively easy. But the agencies, of course, want more. They want text messages from phones. They want recordings from Teams. They want Slack discussions. Basically, any technological way in which employees communicate with one another, the agency wants. And you have to make sure that the search for those different types of communications is thorough, and that the production is done in a well-supported way. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. If the agency later determines that documents that should have been produced were not produced, it can once again lead to delay of the merger review itself. And then you have to explain to the executives why they can't close their deal. Or it could lead to fines and violations. And let's talk about a couple examples of that. Next slide, please. Jean-Maxime, do you want to talk about the EU matters?
Sure, thank you, Bill. So very briefly on these two cases, it is worth noting that in both cases, the incorrect information concerned very technical points, not legal or commercial points, but technical points. So in the General Electric LM Wind case, General Electric stated in one of the many subsections of its very long European filing that it was not developing any offshore wind turbine with higher power output than X megawatts. However, it ultimately appeared that it was not true. And the Commission did not dispute that this was only negligence and that there was no intent to mislead. But this information was important to the Commission's assessment. So it fined General Electric. In Facebook WhatsApp, Facebook stated that it was not able to automatically match the user's account of Facebook and WhatsApp. So in these two cases, the information concerned is not something that the in-house lawyer or the external counsel could have known about. This information was likely came from the business or technical team, but maybe the persons themselves in those teams, they did not know either that it was not true, because someone else within the organization should also have been asked that question. So this stresses the importance of having really a proper process in place and of taking the time, even at a moment where everything is urgent, nobody has time, to make sure that someone with the relevant knowledge does review the relevant part of each submission.
And let me talk about one issue that is just came to light last week in the U.S., and we don't have a resolution of it, but it became known that the U.S. Department of Justice is scrutinizing private equity firms for intentionally withholding information in prior merger submissions. And so all we have right now are news articles about this, but what it appears DOJ is looking at is basically whether the PE firms filled out their HSR form correctly when it came in the section about talking about related companies. And what is very unnerving about this story is that DOJ apparently has opened a criminal probe into the conduct. So not simply a matter of a civil violation, but actually potentially trying to criminally prosecute the company and or individuals who are involved with filling out the HSR form. So we will be keeping an eye on this as it develops, but it shows the seriousness with that the agencies are taking this issue. Next slide, please. This last section here is definitely the worst case scenario. And let me explain what happens here. As I mentioned in the US, the second request production typically requires, parties to submit millions of pages of documents. And in today's day and age, it's hard to know exactly what is in all those documents. And also the time pressure is such that you need to get them into the agency to hopefully start the relevant clock to get your deal review done. We have seen, though, countless examples recently of parties making these submissions and then the agency finding out evidence in those submissions of other antitrust violations. One of the most famous ones was here in the US. It was a merger of canned tuna companies. And what basically happened is a paralegal in the US Department of Justice, it was someone who was 2 years out of college, first job, and was helping the government, conduct the investigation, was reviewing documents and happened to notice an email that was from one company's sales executives to an email address that the paralegal didn't recognize. And she was curious about it, Googled the name of in the email address and found out that it belonged to the wife of a sales executive for a competitor. So basically what you had is one competitor emailing another competitor, but sending the email to that person's wife to try to hide it, from detection. The email is all about fixing prices. The merger review immediately stopped. The DOJ civil section that was handling the review immediately went upstairs in the DOJ building to the criminal section. They opened a criminal case. The company was convicted. The CEO was convicted, went to jail. And it basically just the kind of just a horror story in terms of the consequences that can arise from something like this. We see other examples. The ACCC in Australia had an example where they uncovered during a merger review that the companies basically agreed that until the merger closed, they would allocate customers between each other. Now that is, as Jean-Maxime talked about in the beginning, gun jumping. But what was interesting here is that the ACCC charged it as a cartel, as basically a criminal cartel violation, evidenced by the merger agreement itself. And then finally, and we have seen many of these no poach issues. So this is, as Isabella mentioned, antitrust agencies are definitely interested in how mergers affect employees. What they've uncovered during merger reviews is that companies basically have the HR department has talked with HR departments at competitors and have entered into agreements not to poach each other's employees. The agencies, see evidence of that in the merger review production. a lot of times they will clear the merger in terms of saying that the merger itself does not raise an antitrust issue, but then open an investigation into the no poach and pursue remedies in that. And that's what happened in the Wabtec Nord deal, dealing with railroad car manufacturers. And so it's just something to definitely be on the lookout for. It's the type of thing that I think keeps any antitrust lawyer up at night, just wanting to make sure that the documents that are being produced are clean. If we can go to the next slide. And I think Jean-Maxime is going to talk about why these issues are popping up now. And next slide, please.
So why are these issues more and more under the spotlight? Well, it results of a combination of several factors. So the first one is tougher enforcement policy. Competition law is getting more and more mature in most jurisdictions. The regime have now been in place for quite some time, almost everywhere across the world. So while there was maybe at start some leniency, it is now only natural that competition authorities now seek to enforce those laws more vigorously. They expect large companies that do M&A deals to know about them and to take all appropriate measures. And we see also some jurisdictions where a competition authority had not even been appointed a few years ago, now issuing their first gun jumping decisions. That's the case, for instance, in some African jurisdictions, where we move from no competition law to first gun jumping decisions already. So besides, authorities are progressively granted more and more resources. So they can now not only focus on reviewing mergers, but also on investigating violations. And there's also some kind of emulation among competition authorities. Not only do they obviously want their regime to be complied with, but like everything today, authorities get ranked. There are actually publications, rankings. The authorities get 5 stars, 4 stars, and the authorities communicate on it. Some have made the press releases saying, hey, for the first time this year, we have achieved the 4-star ranking. So this is also something, and that's also how they negotiate the budget with the government of their country. They bring money to the state and they achieve much better returns on investment than private companies. So that's a great argument when negotiating your budget. And that's how they obtain more resources, which they can commit in turn to even more investigations. Another reason is that competition authorities cooperate a lot. So when a given authority uncovers something that may be of interest to another authority, they will share it. There are formal cooperation agreements between certain authorities. There are also broader cooperation frameworks. For instance, the Japanese Fair Trade Commission signed a cooperation agreement with the European Commission already in 2003. The two authorities have to notify each other of cases that affect the important interests of the other, and the Japanese Fair Trade Commission have such agreements with all major authorities across the world. Authorities also cooperate during the investigation itself, for instance, by conducting inspections in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. This was very rare in the past, and it's limited the effectiveness of enforcement actions. But it's now much more common. Authorities, of course, they meet also all the time. They meet in bilateral, multilateral meetings, in conferences, international forums. They share their best practice, their innovations, their new investigation tools, which leads to a third factor, technological evolution. So we all know that we produce a considerable amount of documents and electronic data, which are all stored in multiple copies in hard drives, emails, servers, clouds. So these never completely disappear. They may get lost, but they don't disappear. So in the context of a merger review, the authorities more and more ask companies to produce a substantial amount of such documents. And companies are sometimes even asked to search themselves for relevant materials on the server, in the emails of certain custodians using certain keywords, and all this within very strict timing constraints. and the threat of material fines as well. For instance, in the UK and the United Kingdom, the Competition and Markets Authority has a long-standing practice of such requests. And Bill, I understand this is also quite something in the US.
Yes, it definitely, as I mentioned before, the second request process is incredibly burdensome, and it just is a matter of timing, very, very difficult to go through the sheer number of documents that have to be produced.
And a fourth factor is rush, and M&A deals often come with a lot of documentation, a lot of parallel streams to manage, strong timing constraints. And these are all good ingredients to overlook something, to forget to follow the adequate process, to provide an answer too swiftly without maybe having all the relevant information, or based on a reasonable assumption, which ultimately proved to be wrong. So planning and process are absolutely critical to the success of the transaction, but also to avoid such pitfalls. Next slide, please. And next slide, please.
Thank you, Jean-Maxime. So in view of all the issues we discussed so far, we now present some practical solutions to help ensure that the merger review process does not get mirrored by any of the side investigations. So first is planning from day one. This can be translated as engaging as soon as possible, so as soon as the main features of the deal are known, both internal personnel and external counsel that will be involved in all phases of this deal. We're talking here about due diligence, preparation of the merger filings, and also integration planning. Within this process, the appointment of process managers, possibly from both legal and business sides, but this can be assessed on a case by case, to coordinate the teams internally will likely be crucial to ensure that all process put into place will be followed. Finally, in this first moment, we should preserve all relevant documents. So as Bill said, all people involved should be aware of documents preservation. Following to the due diligence, we should, of course, as discussed, implement some sort of procedure to ensure not oversharing competitively sensitive information. So protocols and clean teams are very useful tools in this part, and it also should be considered where relevant to have some external advisors to handle the sensitive information. This would be an extra layer of care to avoid the risks we discussed so far. In terms of general process points, keeping the number of people involved limited is also another good solution to avoid oversharing and have more control of what kind of information is being shared and what kind of document is being produced. Also, it's important in the process of reviewing the filing form and reviewing the statements that will be put forward concerning the deal. If we have a process manager, as we mentioned in the first, one of the first measures, we would like to make sure that this person is involved in the key work streams of the deal. For example, the drafting of the board and management presentations and the due diligence reports. So we can again ensure consistency and avoid statements that could lead to misleading conclusions or suppressing any sort of information. Also key to make sure all of these measures are indeed effective are the follow-up of these protocols. Otherwise, you would have an inefficient and sometimes burdensome process that would not meet its main purpose, right? So follow-ups are very important, and connected to this, having lists and control of everybody involved, of course, helps the follow-up process. Next slide, please. We turn now to Bill to discuss two other key solutions.
Yeah, so in terms of interactions with the agencies, it's very important from the beginning to implement good document review and production protocols. It's a very complex process, which was beyond the scope of today's discussion, but it's just something that you need to be very mindful of so you're not caught at the last minute trying to quickly have to assemble a major document production. You want to make sure that there's appropriate time and a process in place to have all the statements made and filings that you draft for the agencies vetted with the key business teams. We cannot stress this enough that the business teams need to opine on the accuracy and completeness of the submissions. Otherwise, problems will develop. And then finally, when a transaction involves filings in multiple countries, make sure there's a process for consistency in terms of submissions to all agencies. As Marcia mentioned, I spent a lot of my career at the U.S. Department of Justice. We very frequently interacted with all the other agencies, and it always amazed me when merging parties would say one thing to one agency and something different to me. We found out about it, and we held it against the merging parties. So consistency is crucial.
With with respect to integration planning, what we usually recommend is to have guidelines prepared first. Those guidelines should be detailed and provide practical examples because people would generally know or understand very quickly the main principles, but they are not easy to apply in practice because it's case by case. It's case of given information. There's no general answer to whether it is fine to already do this or that. And people may not be familiar also with the subtleties of whether this given HR information, for instance, is really that sensitive or not from a competition perspective. So the guidelines really need to be detailed and they need to be practical with examples. Also, before any information sharing in the context of integration planning, a few questions should be asked quite systematically. It's kind of like a checklist. So is sharing that information really necessary for the purpose of preparing integration? Is it really necessary to share it now, or can it wait for later? Or is it really necessary to do this now, or can it wait? Are we sharing only what is necessary? Or are we sharing maybe a bit too much? Is it necessary to share so many details? Can we rather give more aggregated, anonymized, general data? Could we be doing this differently? For instance, could we ask external counsel or a trustee to do what needs to be done? Or do we really need to do this ourselves because we're largely the best place to do it and it cannot be done as effectively by a third party? So raising this question is, of course, not easy because after signing, there's often significant pressure from the business side, even from the management to learn more in the acquired business, to start building the future. But it's very important to raise those questions. Another measure that can be put in place and help with this is a pre-integration clean team. So this is a separate, specific clean team, separate from the due diligence clean team, with possibly various work streams, one for each of the relevant topics to be discussed. For instance, IT, human resources, finance, business plan, and all these small clean teams. And you can also have a small clean team to approve for all the targets requests pursuant to the transactional agreements, all the covenants. You can also have a clean team with very few people so that these very few people receive the information, they do not share it, and they take the decisions on the covenants, especially if you fear that the covenants may be a bit strong. And within each clean team, there should be only the key personnel that need to know of that precise aspect and who, of course, are not too involved in daily business. And where necessary, they can also, of course, they can also be supported by external advisors. I would maybe have a final remark in this respect before turning to questions. All the measures, the solutions we've just discussed are not only important to avoid a violation. They're also important to be able to show that the parties did everything they could to prevent such violation. This is very important as well. There was a problem, but we did everything that we could be done to prevent it. So being able to show that the proper process was in place actually can already make a difference. This concludes today's presentation, and we now move on to the Q&A part of our session. I hand over to Marcia to moderate the questions.
Thank you very much, Jean-Maxime, Isabella, and Bill. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the questions and answers, and I think we can take down the slides now. The questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A tab. And we already have several questions that are tied together and overlapping in some ways, related to gun jumping and collaboration of various kinds. So let me ask the first question, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for some of the next questions. So, Bill, I'm going to ask you to start us off on this, but there may be comments from others as well. So you have been discussing gun jumping violations in the context of a merger review, but can companies face these risks if the transaction is not subject to any merger control requirement?
Yes. And so in that situation, what you're looking at is just what I would call a normal antitrust violation. And that's normal is probably not the best way to say it. But is information sharing itself, and this is subject to different nuances in different jurisdictions, can itself be an antitrust violation if it tends to reduce competition. And so when you have that type of information sharing in a non-reportable deal, it does not itself trigger what we say like procedural gun jumping, but it absolutely could be a substantive antitrust issue. And that's where you want your normal kind of antitrust protocols anytime you're interacting with a competitor. I would maybe also mention that in terms of our series of webinars here, we're going to have one, I think in a couple months, all about information sharing. It is the kind of one of the hottest areas of antitrust law right now, especially in the US, where there's a real focus on companies in an industry using a third party to do benchmarking. And does that benchmarking then cross the line into actual agreement or facilitating an agreement on prices? Some of you in the audience may have heard about these cases in the US where algorithms are involved. So it brings up an AI issue about whether or not the algorithm is actually facilitating a price fixing agreement. So those are the types of issues that can arise in either a non-reportable merger or just as outside the merger context altogether.
Maybe also I would add to this that at the very beginning of the process, it is often not clear yet whether there will be any merger control filing. The assessment is still ongoing. But the parties, they already need to exchange information to move forward in the discussions. So irrespective of whether filing requirement was identified, adequate safeguards should be put in place as of the beginning of the process, especially if we're talking of a deal between competitors. It should also be borne in mind that even if there is no merger control filing, there can also be gun jumping under many foreign direct investment regimes. So this is also a risk, possibly. It's the same principles, but so even without merger control filing, we can still face gun jumping. And also there are more and more authorities which have call-in power to review mergers below that jurisdictional threshold. So you may start the process without having any merger control filing, and in the end, you attract the attention of an enforcer who has a call-in power and will call in a transaction, and you end up having a merger review. So on all accounts, it's better to behave as if there will be a merger filing from the very beginning.
Yeah, so that actually takes us to our next question. And this is a question from Ohama-san. If you're willing to speak and tell us your question yourself, I'll ask you to ask if you can unmute. But let me start the question, and then if Ohama-san unmutes himself, then he can ask the question himself. Clement, you may have to do this. But in any event, so a business combination or merger is usually undertaken because there are synergies between the parties. And naturally, there's collaboration at a stage before the actual combination, such as companies visiting customers together to hear about demand or undertaking joint development. And would those activities also be regarded as gun jumping? And if so, how far back does this look at the collaboration activities go? So who wants to start with that question?
I can start, and if others want to follow on. Very interesting question, and something that does come up often. So I think what you're asking is in kind of two different time periods. So maybe before the companies have ever thought about a merger or combination, they might have undertaken some type of joint activity. That activity, could still be subject to the antitrust laws. And so if you are jointly, in the worst case scenario, if you are jointly agreeing on prices with your competitor, that is going to be an antitrust violation, and something that you need to be mindful of. Now, for some, maybe there are times when companies want to collaborate on R&D, and that could be a pro-competitive thing to do. Most antitrust agencies recognize that research and development collaborations are helpful. What's important there, though, is they have to be done in a way that's compliant with the antitrust rules. And what the antitrust agencies are looking for is making sure that any type of joint R&D effort does not spill over into actual marketing of a product where the company should still be competing. So that's the time frame kind of before you're thinking about a deal. When you're thinking about a deal, and I absolutely agree with you that deals are all about synergies, you have to do the analysis to figure out if the synergies will occur, and that's where you would be sharing potentially this competitively sensitive information for you to do the due diligence to figure out if the synergies are real. In that situation, it's, I just think, very important, as we were mentioning before, to follow the protocols, and that is a clean team, and the clean team has to be effective. A lot of times we go to set up a clean team and the client says, oh, I want my head of sales on the clean team. Well, the head of sales really cannot be on the clean team, because the clean team is supposed to be people who are not involved in competitive decision-making. And so the information needs to be shared in that clean team, have the clean team write up summary reports, usually approved by counsel, and then those summary reports can be shared, largely within the deal team, so that the deal team can then assess the synergies.
And to also elaborate on certain examples that were mentioned, the question, for instance, to discuss with customers. Well, that really depends how far you go. Introducing the other is fine, like a courtesy. This will be together as of next year. Please meet my counterpart at. So that's very fine. Then when you start discussing prices or conditions with the customer or supplier, this gets more tricky, because this, of course, would involve exchanging information and even possibly already kind of anticipating the completion of the transaction. So none of these solutions are ideal, but some companies would, for instance, appoint a trustee to do the negotiation. They would hand over the conditions, and the trustee would work through the synergies and come to the negotiation and negotiate on behalf of the two companies, of the two merging parties. In other cases, the two companies would come together and start just discussing generalities together, and then negotiate one after the other. that's not ideal at all. But that's also something we've seen done in the past. Also, what we've seen is renegotiation clauses, having a clause saying, well, as of completion, we'll come back and we'll renegotiate. This is probably the most common workout for this kind of issue.
And maybe one way to think about the situation is put yourself in the shoes of the customer. The customer is entitled to the benefit of competition between the two companies up until the deal closes. And, so that, you want to make sure that the customer gets the benefit of that competition and that you don't do anything to restrict it.
Just one final remark. It should be beared in mind that R&D collaborations and all other sort of collaboration, even if they do not relate to control change of a company or sale of assets, they may still trigger merger control review. For example, in Brazil, we have the possibility of this sort of collaborations, if in a form of a contract where parties share profits and risks, this could still amount to a merger review.
And that's you need to do the kind of the multi-jurisdictional assessment. Isabella is an expert in that, and sometimes the results can be counterintuitive. A collaboration might be notifiable in Brazil, but not the United States, and it is a very fact-specific, country-specific exercise.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. We've come to the end of our hour here. And if people have questions that they'd like to submit later, they'd like an individual response, please email our team as you did to RSVP originally. And again, we can take the questions in English or Japanese. We can actually answer in Japanese, even though we've been answering in English today. I thank everyone for joining us, and we appreciate it, and we would appreciate your feedback and additional comments at any time. I believe we also will be sending out a recording in case that's helpful to people, or offering it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day for the rest of your day.
Thank you.
And look for our third installation, our third episode in November.